Just to make sure you understand, your run-of-the-mill vegetarian doesn't eat meat but enjoys eggs and dairy products. However, a vegan restricts their diet from any animal products, including dairy and eggs. And whether or not you know it, there's a battle going on about which diet is better. Let me just dip into that a little bit. How many vegans does it take to change a light bulb? 2. 1 to change it and 1 to check the label for animal ingredients. Why did the chicken cross the road? Because Colonel Sanders was chasing him, which leads to, why did the tofu cross the road? To prove he wasn't chicken. Yeah, pretty bad, I know. But of course, both the vegetarians and vegans are unified in their opposition to carnivores. How many meat eaters does it take to change a light bulb? None. They would rather stay in the dark about things. Yeah, ooh. Got you with that one. We sometimes get a little more than crazy about the good things that we choose to do for ourselves because they become prescriptions to judge others. Think about the number of things that rise up in our own minds as judgments of others. The way other people raise their children, the way they use money, the political party that they choose, the way they think about gun control, the question of whether or not they smoke cigarettes or you think they drink too much. We make choices for ourselves, but they often become elevated to standards by which we make judgments of others. This is what the Apostle Paul is dealing with in our text today. He's doing it in the context of the early church. Some of the early Christians chose not to eat meat. Others would eat anything. You can tell that Paul comes down on the side of being able to eat everything because he calls those who eat everything that's on the table more mature or stronger in the faith. And the reason for that has nothing to do with whether we're vegans or vegetarians or meat eaters. It has nothing to do with that. It is that some of them come from a history, a background in which there were many different food restrictions. And if you did not eat certain kinds of foods, that showed that you were more faithful to God. And then there were others who said that if you kept these particular festival days, such as the Sabbath and other holy days in the year, that those days were special days and different. And then there were others who thought that, no, those days are just like everything else. And this, too, of course, had to do with the history of those folks who had been raised in a tradition in which these days were to be more important, more holy than other days. And Paul is calling those who can do the broader thing stronger and more mature. They seem like a little nitpicky, don't they, sometimes? We tend not to keep those kinds of strict observances. But I can remember when my brother married a woman that was a Jehovah's Witness. And one of their things is every day's the same. You don't celebrate birthday. You don't celebrate Christmas. You don't celebrate Thanksgiving. But those days are all family kind of days. I can remember saying to my brother, "What do you mean? That's nuts. You're crazy. Of course you're going to get together at Thanksgiving. That has nothing to do with religion. That's an American holiday. All the family, we'll all get together." No, he said, we don't do that. "Well, what are you, crazy?" He said, "No. We are just trying to be faithful to God the way we see it. We're just trying to be faithful to God." So there are issues here that come up in our own lives, in our own families. The core issue here is that different groups set themselves over and above other groups, claiming the high moral ground for their particular group's practices and opinions. From the first century until now, it seems that people manage to develop self-righteous attitudes toward those with whom they disagree, ignoring the injunction that Paul gives a few chapters earlier, do not think more highly of yourself than you ought. And of course, when we judge in these ways, what we do is we stop conversation altogether. And our particular sawhorse that we're riding derails conversation, and our piety habits and other habits become the center of faith rather than the thing itself, which is the gospel. That is the love of God for all creation and all human beings. So Paul has a word that is repeated several times in this passage. In the Greek, krino, and it means to pass judgment. And he asks two rhetorical questions using this verb. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? And why do you pass judgment on your brother or your sister? Well, who are you to pass judgment on someone else? Let's think about that for a moment. Who the heck are you to do that? Or who am I? Paul makes a nice distinction here because he says that you're passing judgments on servants of another. And of course, he's referring to God. And he's saying these other people are servants of God. And in the ancient world, of course, the master, the mistress, could make judgments about what their servants were doing. But you couldn't do that about somebody else's servant. Who are you to make judgments on other people? The implication is, do you think you're God? One of my favorite, I'm sure I've said this to you before, one of my favorite little bits out of Saturday Night Live is the newsroom. Remember when it would open up and Chevy Chase would be sitting there and he would look out at the camera and say, "Good evening, I'm Chevy Chase and you're not." God's God and we're not. And then the second question is a deeper question. It has a bunch of different answers to it. Why pass judgment on your brother or your sister? Why? Good question. Well, here's a couple different answers. I pass judgment on others so I can feel elevated above them. I pass judgment on others because if I try to change someone else, I don't have to look at what changes I might have to make. I pass judgment on others because if I really try to understand the other person's choices, I might have to change. I pass judgment on others because people can really see me as a strong person who's standing up for the right. Or maybe I pass judgment on others because if I could change that person, I would help them. I'm sure you've got your own reasons as well. Paul is not trying to keep the church from honest conversation, nor is Paul trying to say that everyone has to agree. Quite the contrary, he is saying that we can disagree on a whole bunch of things. But he is saying this, that our unity is not found in those things. Our unity is only found in the gospel message, the love of God being the salvation and the shalom of life, the love of God alone being our purpose and our peace. It is our center post, far and above all other things. As much as my mom irritates me sometimes, she said some good things in life. Remember this one? If you point your finger at someone else, and I'm not pointing at you, Steve Miltimore, just to make sure you know. Yeah. If you point one finger at someone else, there are 3 fingers pointing back at you. And my mom kind of had the thing going here with the Apostle Paul. We have these weird ideas about change in people's lives. We think that if we just say something louder and stronger and again and again and again, that somehow they're going to change. And maybe if we could just raise up a little bit higher and point our finger, maybe that will make them change. But of course it doesn't. That is not why anyone changes. A little story that I've told some of you before. It's about a rabbi in the Middle Ages. He was a very holy rabbi. He had deep spiritual wisdom. People came to him from miles and miles away to seek his wisdom, to seek his direction and guidance. And his direction and guidance was to come from his pious practices, because he fasted often. He prayed long hours. He lived on a very little amount of money. He gave everything extra to the poor. He did not imbibe in alcohol or tobacco. He never dressed in such a way that would draw attention to himself. He was always drawing attention to other people. A person of great humility. He had a niece. The niece's name was Mary. And Mary grew up in this little village as well. But you could tell early on that she was struggling with herself and with her life. She did not like to do what the teachers told her to do. She did not want to act like most of the other kids were acting. She did not want to obey what her parents told her to do. She did not want to follow the guidance of her religion. She got mixed up with the wrong group of people. And one day, her parents woke up and she was gone. She'd been hanging out with some of the travelers who had come through the city or the village and were heading off somewhere else. And they waited for her to return a day, a week, a month, and she did not return, and they feared for the worst. But the rabbi had people traveling to him in this little village. And so he got a sketch of his beautiful niece. And when they would come from miles and miles away, he would ask people, "Have you seen my niece Mary? She is so strikingly beautiful. I'm sure you would recognize her if you saw her." "No, I'm sorry, Rabbi, I haven't seen her. I haven't seen her." Until finally one day, a man said, "It is such a striking beauty. I believe I saw her in the city 2 days' journey away, sitting on the steps of a brothel." And in that moment, the rabbi decided that he had to go there. And what he did was spend an enormous amount of money that he should have given away to the poor, but he spent it on beautiful clothes to put on. And he hired a carriage to take him this 2-day journey into the city, and he filled his pockets with as much money as he could. He looked like a businessman of the age. And they pulled up to the brothel and they took him inside and he threw his money around. And he sat at a table to eat. And he ordered all the richest foods that he could order. And he ordered bottles of wine. And he ate this feast. And they knew that he was a person with a lot of money and that he would give them a lot of money and that he would pay for a young woman. So after the meal was over, he asked for a pipe to smoke it. And they asked if he wanted a young woman, and he said yes. In fact, he said, bring all the women that you have here and put them out in front of me, that I might see which one I will choose. And so they all came and stood in front of him. And he looked at each one carefully until finally his eyes landed on Mary. And he said, that one, that is the one that I want. And they brought her over to him. And she looked at him, and he looked at her. And he said, do you know who you are looking at? And she looked at him and she said, I don't know you. Look in my eyes, he said. And she looked in his eyes and she said, well, if I just look in your eyes, you remind me of my uncle, the rabbi, who is a wonderful man, but you couldn't be my uncle, the rabbi, because he doesn't smoke and he doesn't drink and he would never wear clothes like that and he would never be caught dead in a place like this. No, you cannot be my uncle, the rabbi. He would never violate his own pious practices in this way. And the rabbi said, except for one thing. Except for the love of his niece, Mary. And she realized who he was and what he had given up to come to this place for her, for his love of her. And she reached into his big barrel chest and put her arms around him. And he put his arms around her and said, honey, let's go home. What is the most important thing on the planet? It is the love of God. At every moment in our lives, what would happen if the first thing that jumped into our mind was, how do I love this person? When someone comes down on us with some criticism, and maybe they're jabbering a little bit too much at us, what would happen on the whole planet if we all said, oh, my goodness, they're upset. I wonder why it is they're so upset. I know. I got to try to understand them. They need to know how much God loves them, no matter what has happened. This is what we're called to do as Christians. It's an enormous task, but it is a small task because you can do it in your life with those people that are around you, in your family, in your neighborhood, the people at work who you sometimes would just like to toss out the window. You can do it. You're a Christian. You follow Jesus. And the love of God can come pouring through you. And someone might know how deeply they are loved.